Hello, so this is the first lecture, and it is a recorded lecture. So every week I will post recorded lectures for those who cannot attend. And when we meet on Tuesday and Thursday, we will discuss the readings in detail, and we will have a discussion about topics from the reading, and we will also do a close reading of certain passages from the text. So I've posted the PowerPoints online as well. So the first lecture will make reference to Michael Banton's article about the idiom of race, and it is taken from the textbook, Theories of Race and Racism, which we will be using throughout the class. So I will discuss 6 ideas. Firstly, presentism and historical explanations. Secondly, race as a social construct. Thirdly, I will discuss race and the social contract. Fourthly, I'll talk about religious fantasies and the ways that religion was often used to justify colonialism. Then I will talk about science and eugenics, and finally, whiteness and colonialism. So what is race? There are lots of debates in this time period, particularly due to really prominent social movements like Black Lives Matter, and due to a lot of racially charged language during US electoral politics, such as the election and presidency of Donald Trump, which involved lots of incidents of what sociologists would call race baiting, which is often the use of language regarding race to advance one's political position. So what is race? This is a clip from
I think we have a lot of
about the myth of race.
perceptions about what race really is.
What is race has changed dramatically through time.
There is no official scientific definition of race.
We're all different. I was aware that I wasn't white.
The teacher said, no, Tessa's something else. And everybody's eyes are on me and I'm a really shy person. She said, well, what are you, Tessa?
A lot of people imagine that there is some biological tangibility to race because we use it so much. Race really is a social construct, but just because something is a social construct, that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning in people's lives, like money or the nation state or democracy or all these other things that define how we live, but are also constructed.
It influences what you're eating. It influences the type of healthcare you have access to, the type of schooling you have access to, how people feel about you. I mean, it's a powerful marker for all of these things that we care about when we're trying to run a society.
Race has never been something that I don't have to think about. It's put onto us.
When you look at the history and origins of this idea, you start to see it for what it really is, which is the manifestation of power. People imagine that people have always thought about skin color in this racialized way, and we really haven't. That idea is no more than a few hundred years old.
It's not really until the age of colonialism in the 17th century that you start getting the idea that each continent has its own individual kind of people. It arose in a very specific moment in history. In the 17th century, you're taking long trips by ship, and you're struck by how different people look than you remember them when you got on.
So this is the first edition of Systema Naturae, so the systems of nature. And for man, Linnaeus distinguishes 4 varieties. These varieties correspond to the 4 continents. Where it really changes is in the 10th edition of Systema Naturae. This is the foundation of scientific racism. He brings in moral character. So the American is red and choleric and stands up straight. The European, white, sanguine, and muscular. The Asian, sallow, melancholic, and stiff. And finally, the African, black, phlegmatic, and lazy. So these stereotypes have endured through the ages.
If you're going to take a group of people and you're going to decide that they're not people anymore, then you need something to justify that.
You can be defined very differently depending on the country that you're in or the time that you're in. And that's how these categories have always been used. They are political tools that change depending on their usefulness to whoever is doing the categorization. We are one of the most homogeneous species on the planet.
Humans have far less genetic variation than chimpanzees do. And yet those chimpanzees look the same to me.
There were never any pure races. There is no gene that exists in all the members of one race and not another. There is no black gene, there is no white gene.
Human groups overlap completely in their genetic variation.
In the same way that you're related to your family, you can get a kind of fuzzy genetic similarity. But when you get to the continental level, which is really where we're talking about race, that genetic similarity is so fuzzy and so statistically weak as to be almost meaningless.
We have this envy of fields where things are hyper simplistic. We want to be able to look at a genome and say that people are these kind of concrete, immutable things that cannot be changed. Genetics doesn't work that way. It's the product of many genes interacting with each other and their environments. To fully answer the question about what a living thing is going to be about much more than genes.
If I were to go out onto the street today and find someone of Indian heritage like myself and randomly then pick someone who is not of Indian heritage, it is perfectly statistically possible for my genome to have more in common with that person who isn't of Indian heritage than that person who is.
Even though race itself is a construct, racism is real, and we are not in a post-racial society. Race keeps making itself, and power keeps making race.
Even though we know that race isn't biological, we've been living with this idea of it being real for so long that it means that people who do have a shared racial identity have now cultural similarities, which has been born out of hardship, but it's still beautiful and important.
The biology of race is not a useful concept. I have a different historical trajectory. I love the African American tradition, but it's not better than anybody else's. It's just the one that I'm a part of.
I don't think we're going to stop classifying people because I think that's how we make sense of the world. I think every generation is going to classify people according to the criteria that are politically important to them.
I don't think we need to find new boxes to put people in. I think we now have the opportunity to say, we understand that all of these things are a spectrum in a way that we hadn't considered before. So instead of finding new ways to categorize people, we can just find new ways to exist better together.
Race is a story that's handed down and handed around, and we can choose the stories that we tell.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that, be sure to check out these videos next. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and click the bell to get a notification each time we upload a new video.
So the first point I'll discuss is presentism and historical explanations. And the clip touched on some of the arguments that Michael Banton makes in his essay, The Idiom of Race. And Banton discusses scientific racism, eugenics, and also the use of religion to explain racial hierarchy and to justify colonialism. And Banton obviously is not in support of these theories of racial difference. And rather, the article argues that the language of race and racial difference and hierarchy has been used consistently throughout history to justify the theft of land and the enslavement of people, and to justify unethical behavior towards others. So Banton is interested in the ways that contemporary ideas of race are often beset with this sort of presentism, in the sense that we often think about ethnicity and religion and race only in relation to our contemporary time period. And Banton is interested in the way that historical theories of race and racial hierarchy are central to the ways that contemporary hate crimes and forms of discrimination find justification and normalization in our time period. So Banton writes that physical differences between peoples have been observed throughout human history. All over the world, people have developed words for delineating them. Race is a concept rooted in a particular culture and a particular period of history, which brings with it suggestions about how these differences are to be explained. It lends itself to use in a variety of contexts and gets elaborated into a whole style or idiom of interpretation. In the earliest phase of its career, race meant descent at a time when people understood little of the biology of descent. In the 19th century, race became identified with a controversial scientific theory that was found to be erroneous, and which, had science been a more logical, less human enterprise, should have been discarded after 1859. Instead, the old idea was salvaged and rebuilt on a foundation quite different from that of the pre-Darwinian era. While in the present it is being used for purely political purposes to identify communities without pretending to imply that the chief difference between them stems from inheritance. So terms like political purposes are often used when people discuss race. And so what I would argue is that Marxism is often really clear and an intelligible way of understanding the political rationale behind theories of race. So that if there is economic capital to be made, or if there is economic capital that can be hoarded or preserved and then passed on as inheritance among one group of people, those who could be referred to as the ruling class in any society, then explanations of racial inferiority come to justify class antagonism and the existence of extreme class differentials. So from a Marxist perspective, making sense of differences in name or geographical origins or religion also help one to justify the class structure, even if it is really obscene. So as societies become more and more class stratified, um, the language of race might actually become more and more useful. And this is what I think explains the enduring power of race. Even though we might logically understand that we are all human, um, this does not mean that we all have access to housing or food security or job security or the kinds of resources that would even allow us all to stay alive. So Banton discusses certain historical moments like Civil War and slavery and the Holocaust throughout the article. Michael Banton writes, it is noticeable that in the very considerable literature about the nature of racial differences published in the United States after the Civil War, there is a strong tendency to use the word race in the sense of type. It is unfortunate that the major study on American writing in this period, apart from its strong inclination to presentism, regard race and type as synonymous. So if we think about different types of people, then this could cause one to consistently think that certain types of people are not full citizens. So even when people of color are born in countries in the global north, like Canada or America, the United Kingdom, Australia, there might still be this desire to typify people of color as those who are associated with other countries in the global south. And this kind of division of types of people, I think, again, justifies class antagonism. So if I am not really a Canadian or not really a North American or not really from a global North nation, then does this mean that I am not entitled to the same amount of economic capital or healthcare or the same amount of inclusion as someone else who was born in a global north country? And I would argue that equating race with type also justifies xenophobia, which then is used to normalize class antagonism. And it's possible that people of color who are born in global north nations who have exactly the same, if not more, educational qualification and work experience will never make as much money as white people. And I think this is one of the ways that race works to justify the exclusion of non-white people from the middle class over generations. So the article discusses race as a social construct that actually has no biological or scientific merit. And what the author discusses, as many contemporary academics discuss, are the ways that there is no actual scientific merit in dividing people according to race. Two people might appear to be similar to you or to someone else, but this does not mean that they really share in anything. The irony of race is that sometimes the only thing that people might share in is shared forms of discrimination that begin with the assumption that two people are the same because of skin color. Possibly the most notable feature of race as a concept is the way it has inveigled observers into assuming that the main issue is that of the nature of differences between populations and that they should concentrate upon what race is as if this would determine the one scientifically valid use of the word. Physical differences catch people's attention so readily that they are less quick to appreciate that the validity of race as a concept depends upon its value as an aid in explanation. From this standpoint, the main issue is the use of the word race, both in rational argument and in more popular connections, for people use beliefs about race, nationality, ethnicity, and class as resources when they cultivate beliefs about group identities. So I would argue again from a Marxist perspective that beliefs about group identities and kind of emotional or intellectual investments in the idea of group identities are often really determined by class and by an investment in certain ideas of labor and who should do certain types of labor and who should not, or who should live in certain areas and who shouldn't. So Banton argues that irrespective of legal change and changes in thinking and an understanding that race is socially constructed, one often still bears witness to the same repetitive language and tropes regarding race in the media. And there is this consistent failure to allow for changes in how we think about race. So even over 2 or 3 generations, people of color can still be associated with countries in the global south that they might have not even visited or know anything about. And so this kind of refusal of citizenship or refusal of acknowledgement of personhood within the global north is consistent. And again, I would argue it justifies labor exploitation and the exclusion of non-white people from full participation as citizens in the global north. So Banton writes that the failure to allow for changes in the sense in which the word race has been used has important consequences for those who misunderstand the past of their society are likely to misunderstand the present because people judge the present in light of what they believe the past to have been. I would argue that this misunderstanding is not necessarily a misunderstanding, but a real tactical refusal to allow for fair economic competition in order to hoard resources, jobs, uh, spots in educational institutions. So rather than misunderstanding race, I think that people use race to advance their economic position and to hoard resources for themselves and their family members, to also pass on inheritance over generations and to exclude others from certain forms of financial and cultural capital. The past cannot be properly understood if changes in the significance of words are not allowed for. Historians and sociologists judge their predecessors, but will themselves be judged by a later generation because they are not standing outside history. Since the limitation of their knowledge will bemuse their successors, they should be charitable in assessing the limitations of their predecessors. So I don't really agree with Michael Banton. I think that this idea of wanting to do away with race, but misunderstanding it or being incapable of it is a bit rich. I think that people obviously understand that one can use certain markers to make hiring decisions that are highly discriminatory, to make decisions about which books or articles to read and which not to read, which are highly discriminatory. And so I think the limitations of predecessors imagines that race and being a racist is a limitation. However, if one only wants to kind of hoard wealth for one generation and doesn't have any real great ambitions for fair competition or economic improvement, then it is possible to be a racist over and over again in one's own generation in order to just maintain one's own economic position or own forms of capital, or to hoard one's own capital. So if in the educational system, for example, if someone does not deserve a job, but they're friends with someone or they're someone's child, then it could be possible for certain groups of people, like men or white men or white people, to consistently be thought of as great intellectuals or authors or scholars. Will this change over generations? Maybe, but if it's possible to just pass on or inherit certain forms of capital, if it's possible to even inherit certain books or certain ways of thinking or speaking, then that inheritance could be passed on between certain factions of the working class who become the middle class, or the middle class who become rich. So race could also be thought of as a social contract. And if we think about race in terms of the law, I think it moves us away from thinking about ethics and morals over generations. So rather than thinking that our predecessors or people who came before were unethical or misunderstood race, I would rather think about race in terms of the law. That in the past, it was perhaps impossible to hold people, say, accountable. So um, the English and the French who settled in indigenous lands and essentially stole everything in order to build a French and English country, and a white French and English country, could not have been held accountable in law because they were original colonizers who did lots of things before the existence of modern law. And now, with the existence of modern law, one can use the law against people who are racist. The same is true of hiring decisions, of scholarship funding, of housing policy, that one must follow the law. So rather than thinking of good and bad people or misunderstandings, I think it is more useful to think of race in terms of crime. So one of the most obvious ways that race is a crime, or being a racist is a crime, has been documented by anti-racist feminist scholars in detail. So people like Kimberly Williams Crenshaw have discussed intersectionality in detail, and we'll discuss the concept of intersectionality in future classes, and it could perhaps appear on your test. And Kimberly Williams Crenshaw looks at legal cases such as the case of Emma DeGaffney. And Emma DeGaffney was a Black woman who was looking for a job. And what the case proved was that when the employers whom she applied to work for wanted to hire women, they only hired white women. And when these employers hired Black people, they only hired Black men. So this is how Kimberly Williams Crenshaw created the concept of intersectionality, which many people now steal and pretend to be theirs, but it is Kimberly Williams Crenshaw who wrote about intersectionality, and could perhaps quite graciously share her scholarship with others, but it is occurs. So Kimberly Williams Crenshaw then discusses the ways that anti-Black discrimination or anti-Black racism can sometimes be addressed by including Black men, and specifically cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied Black men into workplaces. And sexism could sometimes be addressed by including cisgender, able-bodied white women into workplaces. But the problem is that Black women are consistently unemployed. And so this is a legal question then. How does one's personal preference for normativity and personal preference for, say, cishet normativity, or the way that people look, like kind of really mainstream, cheesy aesthetics, really determine hiring decisions or even aesthetic choices or choices of whose books to read or what art to look at? And so then this becomes a question of law, because one's personal preference for kind of really mediocre things, or average kind of looks, might then cause one to make certain decisions that are not that exciting. So in hiring, and especially if you think about media or film, books that people read, a kind of average mind and average imagination is often drawn towards a set of norms as determining factors of success, or determining factors of, I guess, even morality, that because cisgender, able-bodied white women are kind of normative in certain ways, they might be hired more. And this is also true of cishet, able-bodied Black men. The problem is that when one embodies more than one category of difference, this might be too much difference in really kind of average situations like a workplace, hiring decisions, trying to live in, like, the suburbs. So the concept of intersectionality then explains how discrimination can happen, because it can often happen by including certain people because of one's personal preference for normative things like aesthetics. And Canada has comprehensive laws that have been passed, like Bill C-16, which adds gender identity and gender expression to the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act. So transgender people or non-binary people cannot be discriminated against in hiring. Again, I would argue, though, that this kind of desire for the norm will always kind of cause people to veer towards some form of normativity in terms of gender or race or class or ableism. So the law then is really useful in protecting people who are discriminated against in multiple ways, and in also forcing people to make objective hiring decisions that don't have to do with their kind of desperate desire for aesthetic conformity. So utilitarianism and social contract theory have been used to discuss race in really practical terms. And utilitarianism and social contract theory are rational Western philosophies that look at the ways that rationality and the happiness of the majority are central to the ways that law and rights are used so that the majority of people in a society can be happy, but also so that individual people can have legal rights and have the right to expect others to behave in rational ways. And I would argue that utilitarianism and social contract theory are central to understanding intersectionality because one should rationally expect that whatever they look like or whatever fantasies of sex or reproduction or nation building or um, friendship that people have in their personal lives will not determine hiring decisions that could be made on the basis of objective skills and qualifications. So, utilitarianism is a theory of morality that advocates actions that foster happiness or pleasure and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm. When directed towards making social, economic, or political decisions, a utilitarian philosophy would aim for the betterment of society as a whole. Social contract theory, nearly as old as philosophy itself, is the view that persons' moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live. Socrates uses something quite like a social contract argument to explain to Crito why he must remain in prison and accept the death penalty. However, social contract theory is rightly associated with more modern moral and political theory and is given its full exposition and defense by Thomas Hobbes. So when Crito is told he must remain in prison, this is really about social contract theory that we enter into a social contract so that if one violates the law or one makes unfair hiring decisions that are based on personal preference or bias, they can lose their jobs or they can be fined or even go to jail. And if one lives in a society of laws, then someone could obviously dispute the law and try to change the law or engage in civil disobedience, but many times we accept that we have to follow the law, which is why people pay for things, why people pay for housing, or why people pay taxes. So after Hobbes, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are the best known proponents of this enormously influential theory, which has been one of the most dominant theories within moral and political theory throughout the history of the modern West. In the 20th century, moral and political theory regained philosophical momentum as a result of John Rawls' Kantian version of social contract theory and was followed by new analysis of the subject by David Gauthier and others. Most recently, philosophers from different perspectives have offered new criticisms of social contract theory. In particular, feminists and race conscious philosophers have argued that social contract theory is at least an incomplete picture of our moral and political lives, and may in fact camouflage some of the ways in which the contract is itself parasitical upon the subjugations of classes of persons. So, feminist and race philosophers or critical race philosophers argue that social contract theory is somewhat incomplete because if we accept that we all enter into a social contract and we all have to follow the law and make rational choices, then we would have to believe that one's personal preferences do not determine um, choices in the public sphere. And many feminist and critical race scholars would argue that personal preference and bias, one's kind of personal desires, do determine things like hiring decisions. So, discrimination against transgender people or queer people could be seen as a way that the social contract is violated on consistently because economic decisions such as hiring or about housing could also involve fantasies of nation building and future families. So, the first major definition of the word race given in the Oxford English dictionary is a group of persons, animals, or plants connected by common descent or origin. This is the principal sense in which the word is used in the English in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and it continues to be used, though rather less frequently in this sense. But already in the 16th century, the notion of likeness because of descent was generalized, and race was used to denote instances of likeness without any claim of common descent, like Dunbar's reference in 1508 to backbiters of sundry races, and Sidney's of 1580 to the race of good men. As the dictionary records, this use continued into the 19th century, as with Lamb's reference to the two races of men, the men who borrow and the men who lend, but thereafter it was less frequent. If there was a principle explaining the differences in the appearance of peoples, either theistic or atheistic, then it could have operated through either moral or physical causes. Moral causes would today be called cultural. They consisted of the ways in which men responded to their environment. Physical causes were inherited dispositions and capacities. Both monogenists and polygenists used the word race to designate the outwardly identifiable populations of their time, but the same word meant different things to them. The monogenists believed the men started off the same and had become different because of climate and their different response to environmental opportunities. Polygynists suspected that men must have been different to begin with, and their understanding of race was later systemized as type. So I would again argue that these kind of moral causes and these cultural explanations really mask the economic imperatives of race, and that the idea of moral salvation often justified colonialism. So, in this article, Utilitarianism and Discrimination, Alan Harrell and UC Siegel discuss neighborhoods and the ways that symmetry and asymmetry work in making utilitarian arguments about neighborhoods. The authors write, if, as is usually the case, individual preferences are unobservable, then we cannot claim that utilitarian considerations support the establishment of Black colleges or Hasidic only neighborhoods, while at the same time oppose exclusion of Blacks or Jews from white or Christian neighborhoods. The argument of their paper is the opposite too is false. In general, utilitarian considerations do not support the establishment of white college or the exclusion of Jews from Christian neighborhoods. So this utilitarian principle does not work symmetrically, that you can argue that Hasidic Jewish people deserve their own neighborhoods, but you can also argue that one cannot exclude Jewish people from white neighborhoods. So if we were to return then to the definition of utilitarianism, it is a theory of morality that advocates actions that foster happiness or pleasure and oppose actions that cause unhappiness or harm. So, due to the history of the Holocaust, then morality often rests with historically oppressed people. And in order to alleviate any anxiety and any kind of bad feeling that might arise from uh, mimicking histories of, say, anti Semitism or uh, discrimination, one has to then accept that persecuted peoples often deserve their own spaces and cannot be excluded from mainstream spaces. Well, as I mentioned, race baiting is a term that has been useful in the last 10 years, I think, in discussing how race becomes a political issue. Race baiting refers to the unfair use of statements about race to try to influence the actions or attitudes of a particular group of people, a politician who is being accused of race baiting. So these kind of unfair statements about race are often used to influence actions or attitudes towards people. And race baiting has been common in electoral politics, and I would argue that race baiting is often used as a form of class antagonism. So when one senses that they might lose a position of economic power or political power, race becomes central to how someone maintains power. Race baiting is also useful in masking class antagonism. So if someone is like Donald Trump, who was elected to be the president of the United States of America, then using a language of white masculinity masks the extreme class differentials between very wealthy people and very poor people. So if every person imagines themselves to say be a white man, even if one person could be a white man on welfare or who is precariously housed, and the other person could be a rich white man, then the language of race baiting is useful in mobilizing voters who can vote against their class interests. So the next point I'll discuss is religion and racist rhetoric. And Banton discusses the ways that the Bible was often historically interpreted to justify slavery. And I would argue from a Marxist perspective that religion is the opiate of the masses, that many people turn to religion to justify their own economic exploitation or suffering. Banton writes the typological mode of explanation differed from the previous one in being agnostic about origins. The typologist rejected earlier beliefs that the earth was about 6,000 years old. Whatever might have happened in earlier epochs within the period for which there wasn't an anatomical evidence, types appeared to have been constant. One of the main attractions of typology was that it offered a theory of history purporting to explain the different patterns of human progress. The record of history also contributed to the theory of revealing the special cultural attributes of types that went along with the physical differences. Since changes were the outcome of the essential characteristics of types in relation to particular environments, the theory attributed little significance to purely contingent events, like the reported curse upon Ham's descendants. So, Ham is this character from the Bible whose descendants are thought to be cursed, and the Bible was often interpreted, and Ham as a character was interpreted to justify slavery. Though the typological theory could be reconciled with a belief in polygenesis, it was really of a very different kind. For its appeal, it relied on the one hand upon science rather than the Bible, and on the other upon the growing European acceptance of association between difference in physical appearance and ability to build a progressive civilization. So religion was often used to discuss the ways that, or to construct people of color as being immoral, and science was used to construct people of color as being degenerates and incapable of building a future civilization or incapable of giving birth to children who could build a future progressive civilization. So, one outcome for this religious rhetoric was the conclusion that God had created men of different colors for a purpose, and that each color category had its part to play in his plan. The most striking illustration of this approach to race is found in the early 19th century school of thought, rather misleadingly called nature philosophy. An echo of it can be heard in the New England writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in 1844 was insisting that the civility of no race could be perfect so long as another race was degraded, for mankind was one. Yet within a decade, Emerson had been attracted to Knox's explanation, was arguing that England's economic prowess was the result of the rare coincidence of a good race and a good place. It is difficult to be certain, but it looks as if here, in less than a decade, Emerson switched from a sense of race as descent to that of race as type. It is also relevant that he did so in a book that tried to analyze the character of the Englishman. In later years, there was to be a minority literary industry producing volumes about national character, and it was rooted in the presuppositions of racial typology. So this turn to religion to explain race is something that often happens, and it requires no actual scientific rationality or justification or intelligence. It can just be about endless rhetoric. There's often this kind of chain of signification within Christian Anglophone white societies between, say, angels and whiteness and niceness and morality that is just kind of a casual or a really kind of, I guess, stupid way of just trying to justify class hierarchy. So the next point is fake science and eugenics. So science was often used over and over again to justify race. And Linnaeus was one of the most kind of notorious racial scientists, as was George Cuvier. And Cuvier is often known for actually kidnapping Black women from South Africa and kidnapping specifically non-white women from former colonies, and at the time what were European colonies, and doing a whole series of scientific experiments on genitalia and brains. So the case of Saartjie Baartman is one of the most obscene and disgusting examples of scientific racism, and it involved white Europeans' kind of real perversion towards the bodies of Black women.
Transported to a foreign land, stripped of her dignity and paraded like a circus animal for the sake of entertainment. It's a true story of Sarah Baartman, who was dehumanized and exploited by a dude who is hailed as a hero in world history. I'm A.B. Tucker, and this is Ill Will, a 5-part series dedicated to examining and exposing the long history of gross medical mistreatment targeting Black women around the world. Georges Cuvier is celebrated as the father of paleontology, the study of fossils, and is revered as one of the finest minds in history. But a lesser known part of his legacy involves his encounter with Sarah Baartman, a Black South African woman and member of the Khoikhoi tribe who was born in 1789.
She had sort of a tragic childhood. Her parents died very young. She married very young. She had children that also died while they were babies.
In October of 1810, at the age of 20, Baartman, who didn't understand what she had consented to, was trafficked to Europe by a British officer who promised her she would appear in theatrical shows. Upon arrival, Baartman was sexually exploited and derisively named Hottentot Venus by her new owners, who publicly exposed her naked body in a cage alongside animals to paying customers.
She was put on display naked because people were very intrigued by her Black body, that she had sort of proportions that we think are normal for Black women. She had large buttocks. She did not have a flat stomach. She had large breasts. And so they put her on display, like along with circus animals, so that people could sexually assault her and touch her and exploit her. And white men profited off of that, and they made money until the day that she died.
Powerful men like Cuvier paid money for private demonstrations in their homes where they would sexually exploit her. Cuvier then turned Bartman into his own personal science experiment. Cuvier, who clearly had a fetish, examined Bartman in his laboratory and used her as a case study to perpetuate the racist theories claiming the inferiority of African people. Tragically, Bartman died at only 26 years old on December 29, 1815. Following Bartman's untimely death, Cuvier secured the right to dissect her body. He pickled her brain and genitals in jars, which would be displayed in a Paris museum until 1974. He also made money by making a plaster cast of her body and using it as a display to attract visitors. And his name is one of 72 inscribed on the Eiffel Tower.
So Sarah Bartman is sort of this example of how Black women's bodies were to be mocked, how they were thought to be commodities. It's also a legacy of why Black women today are seen as over-sexualized or immoral. This idea that Black women's bodies are for other people and not for themselves.
After years of advocacy and at the demand of President Nelson Mandela, Bartman's remains were finally returned to South Africa in 2002, where she was then laid to rest in her homeland. Sarah Bartman's story serves as a reminder of the extreme exploitation, objectification, misogyny, and racism endured by Black women. And though history may continue to honor the oppressors, we will still shine a light on the women who deserved a voice and whose stories deserve to be told. This is Ill Will, an examination of the gross medical mistreatment of Black women and how this history shaped the healthcare crisis we still facing today.
So we'll discuss crimes in the healthcare system when we talk about forced sterilization of Indigenous women in the Canadian healthcare system. And the Canadian healthcare system is now facing a whole series of class action lawsuits throughout Canada and in every province now, I believe, about forced sterilization of Indigenous women. And I would argue that white feminism as a concept really makes little sense because many of the most extreme forms of violence against women and extreme hate crimes have been against Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. And so in the cases of the sterilization of Indigenous women, it's sometimes been white Canadian nurses and doctors who are white women who have sterilized Indigenous women against their wills. So we'll discuss then the ways that race has shaped the feminist movement as well, and the ways that whiteness and investments in white supremacy have made it impossible for the feminist movement to really gain any credibility. So the final point is white supremacy. And whiteness and white supremacy is something that Banton touches on. And Michael Banton argues that theories of race, whether they are scientific or religious, often all lead back to this idea of white supremacy. The idea of race was important to Europeans in the late 19th century on account of its value in philosophies of history. It was widely believed that the success of the European powers sprang from the qualities inherent in the white race or races, and that these promised continuing European supremacy. So there are other forms of racism that people, and specifically people in North America, often want critical race scholars to discuss, like caste. Right. Unlike caste, though, or caste-based discrimination, European supremacy or white supremacy extended all throughout the world. So while there are localized systems of caste discrimination, say in India or different hierarchies in Asia, white supremacy has extended throughout the entirety of the world due to European colonialism and the forced Christianization of colonized peoples throughout the world, and the forced assimilation of people of color to an English language school system. And to, I mean, the most obvious example is money and the ways that countries in the global south were forced to be part of the global economy. So the bulk of the population, writes Banton, is more likely to believe that the ups and downs of nations in history are a reflection of technological skill and material resources, though this is not a question that has been thought worth detailed investigation. Probably more people would agree that the cultural characteristics of racial groups are an outcome of environment and opportunity than would consider them genetically determined. Those who believe that the universe was built by divine design and that everything in it has a place in that design might well echo the racial romanticism of an earlier era. So it is interesting to think about how one makes sense of race in this time period. This kind of idea that everything has a purpose or there is a meaning to everything is a kind of religious set of ideas that has often been used or that was used historically to justify slavery and colonialism. I would argue that in this time period, the kind of religious, I guess, fervor or exaltation, this kind of positivity of, oh my gosh, this happened for a reason, I'm blessed, has been replaced with the language of positive branding. There's a book called The Burnout Society by Byung-Chul Han, and the author discusses the ways that this kind of cult of positivity often defines contemporary capitalism. So this need to constantly say positive things on the internet or to offer some kind of totalizing, satisfying explanation for societal phenomenon, like this is great and everything works and things have a purpose and everything will work out in the end, is a kind of language of contemporary branding society. It also determines the ways that self-betterment and kind of self-flagellation determine our contemporary capitalist moment. So we are constantly thought to work on ourselves. And it takes us back almost to religion, this kind of self-flagellation of religious subject who must constantly repent and purify themselves while also having this belief in positivity. And contemporary capitalism is something that Byung-Chul Han argues works towards this kind of work, rests on this kind of endless positivity, which will inevitably lead to the burnout of the individual subject because capitalism, of course, is not, it's not a really equitable idea. The idea that there is meaning behind everything obviously will not make sense to those who are made homeless and poor. If one is discriminated against consistently and cannot find a job, irrespective of educational qualifications, if one is consistently discriminated against because of skin color, then this kind of positivity or the idea that everything has meaning or purpose will not be satisfying. So legal reason, I would argue, is of course preferable to this kind of exaltation of some grand design. So I'll play this final clip about a rise in white supremacy. So theories of race date back to many centuries ago, and the Cuvier experiments were really horrific examples of the killing of persons in the name of scientific racism, and even entertainment. And while one would think that we're in a different time, what sociologists and political commentators have noted is the rise in white supremacy or alt-right movements on the internet. And white supremacy often has a different face, so that the kind of old forms of white supremacy, like the Ku Klux Klan, have often been replaced by middle-class, educated liberals who are still white supremacists and who might use a kind of coded language to soften certain claims, but who will still rely on ideas of religious morality and white superiority to justify their life decisions and to justify violations of the law.
White supremacy is on the rise, and it has a new face driven in large part by the rise of the alt-right. White supremacists believe the white race is in danger of extinction. They feel like they're being replaced, blaming non-whites for their national economic troubles.
White people should have the same treatment as any other groups. We should be able to stand up for ourselves.
Middle-aged and overwhelmingly male, white supremacists have moved from online activism into the real world. This is Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, who says white supremacy has a new, more subtle look.
They're not wearing the white robes of the Klan, and they're not wearing the black leather jackets of the skinheads.
So I would argue that this idea of equality should really be fought against. When you've hoarded so much of somebody else's land to build golf courses and shopping malls that have destroyed the environment, that no, equality is not yours. There need to be some sort of provisions in place to stop greedy people and to redress all of the imbalance in society created by land stealing white settlers.
Many of them are white collar workers. They're well educated, they're sophisticated in their use of technology, they're sophisticated in their language and their construction of narratives. So the movement really has changed its face.
In the US, public white supremacy events have increased by 123% since 2016. By 2018, the number of known hate groups in the US rose to its highest level in 2 decades, pushed by a combination of political polarization, anti-immigrant sentiment, and social media platforms that spread propaganda online.
What is different now is people are more empowered to come out with their beliefs, thinking that it's become normalized because of various factors such as the Trump election in the States, the rise of nationalism throughout Europe and Brazil and throughout the world.
And sometimes it could have deadly consequences. A man murdered 50 worshippers and critically wounded 9 more at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand on March 15th.
These are not lone actors. They acted individually, but they're shaped by a greater collective of which they're a part.
The guns used in the mass killing were decorated with the names of several violent white supremacists. Experts believe there is a trickle-down effect when it comes to feeling emboldened.
When people turn on the TV and they see constant battling between the left and the right, they see Trump saying openly racist things on CNN, and they're feeling enabled that they too can now come forward and share beliefs that they previously thought were embarrassing or shameful.
Hadigan is a former white supremacist who helped shut down the Heritage Front, one of Canada's most powerful white supremacist groups in the 90s.
Unfortunately, with the advent of the internet, somebody can recruit from 2,000 miles away. The message propagates faster than anything we've ever seen before.
Recruiting tactics are ruthless. She says they befriend those with low self-esteem, the people who feel like they don't belong. Hadigan immigrated from then communist Romania as a young girl. Her father died and her mother was abusive. She ended up in a foster home.
So I was 16, just dropped out of high school and really angry and alone and didn't have a sense of belonging, didn't know who I was. And one day I was watching television and I saw a guy, clean-cut man in a suit, talking about what's wrong with being proud of your European heritage.
She was soon the face of the organization, a clean-cut, innocent-looking European girl.
I was groomed very quickly. Within a month or two, I was speaking at rallies. I was paraded in front of the media as a spokesperson for the organization, and I was taught how to recruit other people.
The trick, find a person's worst fear and let it fester.
Maybe they lost a scholarship to an Asian student, or their girlfriend left them for a black guy, whatever it was, I was taught to figure it out and go in for the kills.
The message is this: hate is self-preservation. Hadigan says today's hateful messages are now disguised as free speech.
The move that I call going from the boots to the suits.
Looking back historically, the Ku Klux Klan emerged in the late 1800s and reemerged in the 1920s, where public lynching and racial terrorism was common practice. It comes back again in the 80s, except this time with neo-Nazi influence from white power skinheads. Experts say the last wave is where we are now, where mostly white middle-class men who believe the rights gained by immigrants or other minorities is a sign of their rights being taken away.
While they're fighting for free speech, the messages can actually reach vulnerable people, people who are more at risk of not understanding the difference between reality and fantasy or conspiracy. And those people will take that message to heart and feel like they have no choice but to go out and kill people.
Robert Gregory Bowers killed 12 Jewish worshippers in 2018. Alexandre Bissonnette massacred 6 Muslims the year before. And Dylan Roof murdered 9 Black Christian parishioners in 2015. The problem today, Hadigan says, is that online recruitment and hate speech is difficult to shut down. Speaking as a former white supremacist, she says all she ever needed was to be accepted.
The problem is when we don't have conversations about immigration, about the changing demographics. Those conversations are happening in echo chambers among websites and people who are hateful. And unfortunately, we have to confront that with facts as to why we need the immigration, as to why diversity is a strength and not something that is corroding people and their, and their fears.
So white supremacy, and I think specifically the kinds of incidents that we see now in this time period are perhaps a direct response to changing demographics. So in the period between 2010 and 2015, births to Muslims made up an estimated 31% of all babies born around the world, far exceeding the Muslim share of the global population, which stood at 24% in 2015. So by 2035, researchers have estimated that Muslim children born will outnumber Christian births. And this is really unprecedented. So what researchers have found is that the world's Christian population is also still growing, but far more slowly. And if we look on a country by country basis, many European countries will have a higher percentage of young Muslims than other groups of people like Christians or Catholics, specifically in the period between 2035 and 2060. So globally, between 2055 to 2060, the birth gap between Muslims and Christians is expected to shrink to just 6 million. And so the point is that when you look at all the extensive data, and what researchers are trying to document are the ways that the global population is going to change. And what this means is on an everyday basis, one is going to see more and more people of color and more people who are not Christian in global North countries. And attacks against mosques, Islamophobic hate crime, xenophobia, and the rise of Christian alt-right movements are perhaps very negative reactions to change. So as these demographics change, then one will need more and more specific laws, bills, policies in place to protect the future population. And one will also obviously need to accept change. Toni Morrison is one of many African American or Black American is also a term that is often used in this time period. Authors, and specifically Black feminist authors, who wrote extensively about race throughout her lifetime. And Morrison wrote that race as an idea really inhibits one's imagination and one's capacity to feel empathy for others or to share space with others. Morrison's writings specifically about race and language were really exemplary in looking at the ways that language limits our capacity to know and our capacity to think about human subjectivity in nuanced ways. Toni Morrison was a Nobel Prize winning author, and I think it's specifically interesting to think about Toni Morrison's very complex writings about women. The ways that women's lives are often determined by different structures of power and different forms of agency. So I'll finish with this quote by Toni Morrison: "The function of freedom is to free someone else." So that is all for the first lecture. We'll come back to these themes throughout the class. Firstly, the historical ideas of race and why race was always discussed in terms of science and religion. And the next class will discuss Robert Miles' writings about Marxism. And I personally, and I guess from a scholarly perspective, my understanding of race is rooted in Marxist thinking. And I continue to believe that the language of race and the use of race is about class antagonism. So we'll also discuss intersections of religion and race and gender, and I will continue to come back to this idea of Marx. And Marx wrote that the ruling ideology is the ideology of the ruling class. So I will discuss the ways that ideas of racial superiority justify class antagonism. So that is all. Thank you very much for your time.